All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Prefab Review podcast slash video screen slash whatever mediums this is on. I'm Michael Frank from Prefab Review, and today we are lucky to be talking with Toby Long of Clever Homes. Toby is, I think this is his third or fourth time doing video and audio stuff on our platform, but he's been one of the most helpful people in the industry to us. He's an architect based out of the Bay Area. And I guess, Toby, you can speak more to what you do, but I'd say doing a sort of combination of high-end single-family homes as well as sort of multifamily and commercial stuff. And the motivation behind having Toby on today, beyond just his general wealth of knowledge on prefab stuff, is to talk about evaluating land and lots. So we, in general, get lots of questions of people sending us Redfin links, sending links to, Zillow and saying, hey, should I buy this? Can I just, buy this piece of land at $7,000 and throw a prefab box on it? And have I just figured out a cheaper way to build housing? Typically speaking, that's not true. But there are cases where that arbitrage is real or where it makes a ton of sense to build. So what we're going to do during this video is we're going to talk through 4 or 5 examples that are pretty indicative of the kinds of land that we discuss with people every day, and basically go back and forth and chat live. So we've each looked at these a tiny bit, but not that much. But right off the bat, Toby, how are you?
I'm doing good, Michael. Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
Okay, so before we do this, the other motivation behind this is for our newsletter and our site, we're actually revising our typical land diligence checklist because we think it has some areas that could be improved. So, Toby, I was going to show you what we have at first, and feel free to rip it apart. And then we can sort of use that as context of other stuff you'd look for, and then we'll dive into land. All right, so everyone should be able to see my screen right now. But yeah, so basically the number one things, just running through these points, are site access. And this is really particularly with modular homes in mind, right? Can you get a crane and a truck back there? Because a lot of the projects we work on, we're talking about modules that are 40, 50 feet long, sometimes maybe 20 feet long. So you basically need to be able to, get them back there. And then you need to be able to get a crane back there. Then the power lines thing, I don't know your thoughts on this. I consider this not typically a deal breaker, but like something that can make life more complicated. And then there's just a bunch of stuff. Most of these aren't things that are necessarily deal breakers outside of can you access it with a truck and a crane, but it can make things a lot more expensive. So like, is there a reasonable building pad? Is there a driveway if that's required? Is like sometimes you get these lots that really like aren't buildable because of setback issues or other weird stuff. Then the survey and geotech, again, especially the geotech stuff, that a lot of times that's more of a determinant of cost in terms of like more expensive, complicated foundations. Are there floor area ratio max coverage issues? Again, that's largely permitting stuff. Can we actually build what we want to build on the site? The design review process, HOA stuff, we have all the time in like sort of certain more Tony areas, making sure that what you want to build is consistent with that. One of those sort of things since we've been doing this whole company and modular stuff over the last 5 years or so that I've been really pleasantly surprised with has been how helpful local planning departments frequently are when you just call them in terms of educating on a lot of these issues. So we typically recommend that everyone calls the local planning department at least before, even if it's sometimes after the land's under contract, but at least before completing a transaction. And then there's a bunch of other stuff that's like, if it's a high risk area, again, you can typically figure out insurance and stuff like that, but can make things a lot more complicated, a lot more expensive. And then I think the other areas that typically get really expensive, though you can typically deal with them, that I think we'll talk more about in this sort of remote land situation, are how close are utilities in a working road? Just because, if you're going to be paving, a 1 mile driveway or extending power from somewhere, it seems like that can get complicated. So just off the bat, I know you haven't looked at this list. Are there other checklist items that you kind of look for right away when evaluating lots?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is great, Michael. I think that you're doing a real service for people and trying to like get ahead of a lot of these questions that I think most folks don't necessarily think about right away. Obviously, this is a really hard part of projects for so many reasons. It's easy to get really excited about land. I think people see opportunity in, certain land values, certainly where that starts to look really inexpensive. As you reflected, that's often an indication of complexity. I do think that this is, such an important aspect of building any kind of project. For sure, you've got to connect with the land. There's a visceral element here that's hard to quantify. We have to want to be in certain areas. And of course, it's, additionally challenged by the fact that certainly here in California, there's just not a lot of land. There's a lot of land, but land for sale that's buildable is getting harder and harder to find. The good news, I think, is that construction technology and techniques are continuing to advance and improve. So we can build on topography or in areas that were previously really challenging, I think, for building projects. And I would apply some of this to, offsite construction and modular building in particular. I do like that you start this process with the assumption of modular construction, as we're all, in promotion of factory partnership and prefabricated building methods in all of their various forms. My pitch to clients is often to start with modular. It is maybe the most profound change to the way that we build, but it's also the most rigorous. And if you can start to navigate through a modular scheme on a particular building site, I think all of the other techniques within the industry are, of course, applicable, assuming that modular construction starts to become too challenging or difficult. So, I think that your summary here is a really good one. The things that I look at are, sort of a two buckets. One is just what is like immediately observable. When people call us, I kind of think about what can I do online? How do you leverage Google Maps? I mean, consistently reflect on what did we do before this?
Right.
What happened before Google Maps? But like
Google Earth is amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, like how can you get, can we look at the property? Can we see things from a different, kind of online perspective that gives a quick reaction? And there's kind of that bucket, and you capture a bunch of these. And then I think there's the more detailed observations that come from really looking more closely at disclosure packages, talking to jurisdictions, trying to, in other ways, dig a little deeper, literally and figuratively, into, what might the property require to be successfully developed. The one thing that might be interesting to point out here that has definitely been an evolution over the last 5-10 years or so is that most communities have a geographic information system online available to people. This is, the GIS systems. And usually if you Google your local town or county, there's some way to identify parcels within their GIS mapping program. And that's usually tied back into, at the highest level, planning law and codes, development standards, things that you can kind of read into the zoning of the site. I think there's valuable information there. And some GIS systems are as sophisticated as to map back to water and sewer and power and other kinds of infrastructure. So it's a really helpful tool that I use. I certainly promote, other people become familiar to a degree with these kinds of systems. They don't answer all your questions, but I think it's a good way of just starting to understand what kind of information a local jurisdiction has about your property, and usually in combination with, mapping software, Google or Apple or whatever maps, I think you can start to have a kind of high level overview that you can start to look at pretty quickly. So, and my list is very similar. I think these issues of slope and topography are really critical. Access and power lines are for sure. I'm kind of with you, Michael. I think power lines aren't unto themselves a showstopper. We've had some success in working around power lines. Not surprising to hear. They tend to be, end of the road, not in the middle of the grid kind of power line situations. But they definitely can be rigorous. It puts yet another hurdle for offsite construction to kind of climb over as people are trying to make a case for these techniques. So I think power lines are really important to understand. Things that I also look at just kind of at a high level are, surrounding homes. Not that that's a hard thing to identify or conclusive, but obviously a property surrounded by existing homes is a little bit easier to contemplate building a new one than being in a rural location, as I know one of the lots you're going to show will indicate. I also think that there's observations that can be made around fire infrastructure that you can also get ahead of, just identifying hydrants, looking at even manholes in the street and stuff that you can kind of see in that mapping software. And then the more detailed stuff that I think is on your list often comes from either further investigations, like talking to the planning department, as you mentioned, is invaluable. I also find planning agencies to be extremely friendly, very sort of consumer oriented in a way. And so getting in front of planning departments, sitting down at the counter, heaven forbid, having a face-to-face meeting can be super valuable. Most planning agencies are able to return phone calls pretty quickly in our experience. So I think you can get good information there. And we do find that a lot of properties that I come across do have reasonable disclosure packages. Maybe it's from a attempted project and there's existing, reports and data. Sometimes it's just from due diligence that owners have had on properties. So I always encourage clients to go chase those disclosure packages down really quickly so we can start to understand the details that might be inside of that. But I think your list is great here. I think it's a great way to start and to begin to literally check some boxes that I think open up the opportunity for these kinds of conversations.
So just to, as I said, we're going to revise this in an email we'll hopefully send out to everyone in the next couple of weeks. But the 2 or 3 areas that I'd say we're going to certainly add to this, and we might even figure out some other ones during this discussion. And I don't consider them like the sort of first order diligence things, but things that we've just sort of found through experience are really important for people to be comfortable with. Is one, just the economics cost benefit of and me and Toby were talking about this a little bit before in terms of the existing macro conditions of, okay, when you pencil this out, is modular and prefab really the right way to go? Then sort of secondly, this is a general construction thing, but also a prefab modular thing. Like, are you comfortable with the timing? Meaning if you're doing a process that might take 18 or 24, God forbid, maybe even a little longer than that, does that basically work with you? And again, it's not as much of a, is this land right, like doable, as much as is this happily doable for you? And then the third thing, which we sort of have here, but not as explicit, that we've actually found out to be pretty helpful, is actually trying to call an insurance agent early in the process and getting quotes from them. And again, we can talk about ways of doing that. Typically, to the extent that you're able to build relations with any neighbors or the existing people who have the land, and just find out who insures them, especially in California and some other areas that are a little more like close to the coast or wildfirey, et cetera. That's been sort of an unfortunate surprise at times. So yeah. All right. So with that being said, as you guys can probably see, there's 4 or 5 lots representing sort of different types of projects that are hopefully indicative that me and Toby are going to dive into. And one of the things that is kind of interesting is we were actually planning to do this conversation maybe like 2 or 3 months ago, and then I don't know, skiing for Toby and having kids for me got in the way. So what you'll see is some of the lots that we actually highlighted that I thought were easier have not sold, whereas some of the ones that actually seem more complex have sold. So that's just kind of an interesting thing in the process. So anyway, so we're going to dive into it first. And again, a lot of these are going to be in California because it's where Toby and me are both located. So we know the areas reasonably well, but this is, the same process you'd go through anywhere. It's just the costs might be 2 or 3 times as high here. All right. So Montera, hopefully you can see this now. This is 825 Montera. I'm just going to, hopefully I don't do this too quickly. This is basically, to your point, this is a pretty flat lot located near the coast, 825 Edison. And you can see it's actually, doesn't look too crazy. It has you know, a bunch of houses literally next door to it. Let's see, we can look at this specific stats on it in 1 second. But yeah, it's 6,000 square feet. But you can see, I think it's been on market for about 926 days, which is right 2 or 3 years, which is kind of a very long period of time. So and let's see if there's been any price reductions or anything. Yeah, you can see there actually have been recent price reductions. So that's generally like once in a while you'll see these like kind of dead listings that are on the same price for years and years, and that's like someone listed this and they didn't really care about this. This person is actively cutting the price, so it appears they actually do want to sell it. So yeah, so what are the things you look at here that you'd want to dive into when looking at this lot? And what?
Well, I think you hit the first one, right? Which is sort of why is this not sold? I mean, I think that's a really good, actually, it's not on your checklist, but it's actually a really good thing to look at is, is this a property that hit the market 5 days ago? Is this 3 years now? And with price reductions, to some extent, there's a behavioral sort of note here. If a property hits the market and it's been 5 days, the way that you behave and the way that you need to act with regard to that lot might be very different than something that's been sitting there for 3 years. Right. Property is going to move pretty quickly in a lot of areas, certainly that where you and I are working. Property is valuable and people are looking to build new homes. I think partly people are frustrated with existing houses and the cost to renovate and modernize are so high that a lot of folks that call us, I know, are interested in trying to just make it for themselves, which makes complete sense. So I think that's sort of number one. This would be sort of a disclosure, question for me. Hey, let's see what the sellers know. Is there a failed project here or not? So there are some subtleties about this area, Michael, that I may actually have had something to do with this.
Can I ask a question on that before we jump into that? So, right, like we see land generally being on the market longer, if for anything, for just because like doing diligence takes a long time. So, right. So this isn't like, in my experience, like if something's on the market for like 31 days in like San Francisco or Marin or whatever, you usually assume it's mispriced or something because it shouldn't be on the market for that long. When obviously 900 days or whatever this property's been on is a long time. Is there like a certain time threshold like that where you start to like kind of raise red flags? Is it like 90 days, 180 days, et cetera for you?
Yeah, I don't know. It's sort of arbitrary, but I would sort of put around 100 for some reason.
Okay.
That sort of sounds right for
me. That sounds right. A couple months, yeah.
Yeah, like a couple months is not tied to market cycles. Like this thing's seen a couple market. This has seen at least a market cycle. The property
right. 2021, everyone was buying everything. Right.
Well, right, and Montera has probably seen some up, and then maybe it softened a little bit over the last year or so. So there may be something going on there. As we know, and as it really kind of spelled out in your checklist, and maybe this is something valuable for people to understand. It's sort of obvious, but I think you have to talk about it too, which is land is proportioned. The value of land is proportional to the value of the property that you're developing at the end, right? Mm-hmm. So property value is going to drive land value. So if you can, build $1 million home, land is valued so appropriately. If you could build a $5 million home on the lot, land is valued appropriately, and that obviously scales quite a bit. I tend to mostly argue that I think land is 20, 25, maybe 30% tops of the final value of finished real estate. So I think therein lies a certain projection that you could make. This property is listed for close to $300 something thousand. Would not be out of the question that a final value of a property or a home on this site would be, in 1.2, 1.3, 1.5 kind of range. And so that can gate a little bit of this. And it may have been that originally 3 years ago, when the land was valued at $600,000, somebody thought you could build a $3 million house here. And actually that's proven to be wrong. And so the land value has had to fall in order to meet the value of real estate in this part of San Mateo County. So I think that's a great, observation. I think that 100 days sort of feels like a gate to me. Beyond that, it might be that there's more technical issues. I do think there's another part of this, Michael, which is that a lot of land that's, that sells quickly probably being purchased by developers, by spec builders, people that are
Yeah.
out building for profit are looking actively for land constantly. And I think it's that next group that's a little bit harder to build on, that a lot of clients find, or a lot of homeowners find. It has been out there for a while because it maybe doesn't have the same opportunity for margin that a developer would be looking for. It has some complexities in some category or another. So my guess is there's a little bit of that going on this site that probably could be revealed through disclosure, or just trying to understand some of the nuance of this particular area, because there are some unique characteristics of this part of San Mateo County.
Is your perspective on this? So is your best guess basically? So if I was coming up with a thesis on why hasn't this sold, and what are the things to look for, I have sort of two theses. And again, you probably will be able to debunk one of them. One is there's something like horrific from a regulatory standpoint here, or permitting standpoint. So this is just so we're clear on location, everyone. This is very close to the coast. Would this be coastal commission stuff? This close to the coast?
It could be. It's going to be handled by the planning department. So I don't know if the coastal commission gets involved there.
I don't think so.
Planning. I don't think so either. But even if it was, it wouldn't.
If you got close, that I've heard fun things. And by fun things, I mean painful things about dealing with that kind of planning. And then the other thing that I think is, or like the other thing that I think is pretty likely, and I think you were getting to this, is Montera's quite nice, but it's not one of the highest end parts of the Bay Area. But but it is a little more remote than certain areas. So you may be dealing with a potentially narrower but still costly construction group of subcontractors, etc. So it might just not pencil, honestly, right? Like you might say, oh, in this area, it's going to cost like $500 plus to build a house. And I don't know, maybe the after build values, once you get in, all the soft costs are essentially, the same cost or less than the actual land plus house. So I don't, those are some theses on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Michael, so I would just kind of like just like you have in your checklist, which is super valuable, and we can use it too. But like just going through the basic stuff, like the slope of the property doesn't seem wildly challenging. No. Access is good. There are no visible power lines that seem to be particularly problematic. There are some trees on the site.
I was going to ask, would you be concerned about heritage trees and stuff like that?
Yeah, they look like they're eucalyptus. So even though they may require a permit, they're probably not protected, although there might be cypress here. So there might be some other things that get sort of folded into that. I don't think that's a deal breaker. But
just so everyone's clear, if you have essentially old trees that are of certain species, I guess is the right term.
Well, the way I would look at it is, most municipalities have protections around trees that are large enough to be considered community asset. Mm-hmm. They're part of the environment. And so usually what happens is that trees over a certain size in most communities require a permit for removal. And then that usually gates around trees that require permits that are non-heritage trees. Like in this instance, the eucalyptus would not be a heritage tree. Mm-hmm. So you could just receive a permit. Trees of certain species in this area, coastal redwoods, oaks, cypress, other kinds of trees that may be categorized as heritage trees require a different permit process, and often require discretionary approvals that go with design review, or they require mitigation. So when you take it out, you have to plant new ones,
right?
These kinds of things. My instinct on this property is that while there are valuable trees around it, I don't think someone would cut all of them down, and surely any that are impacted by construction activity get removed anyway, or that are hazardous. So part of the
and certainly people did that on the adjacent lots because you don't see the same trees.
I think the team checklists as you go through stuff is kind of like, do you need an arborist? In this instance, there would be an arborist on the site that would produce a tree report that goes with the permit application. But I think going back to the basics, you can probably check all the boxes on access, infrastructure, delivery, setting up cranes, taking mods. My suspicion, having worked in the area, is that the soils aren't deeply problematic. There are houses around the site, which I think goes back to buildability. There may be some technical stuff that has to be resolved through the foundation design. We see that pretty frequently, certainly in seismic areas with a lot of sand and water. You can get different characteristics that kind of emerge as engineering functions. And so I think you can kind of get through all that. My gut is like yours on this particular site, is that there are maybe two things that I would start to really understand first. One is just the value, right? I think the recent cost reduction was like April of this past year. So they're about a month from when we're doing this. Maybe that's going to be part of the key, because at $600,000, it doesn't make sense. At 300,000 and change, it starts to look a lot more interesting for the value of the home that would be created here, or for the potential buyer in the current market that might be looking to build this particular kind of home. But the thing that concerns me a little bit more about this lot that I would want to look at more closely could pertain to infrastructure and utilities. Historically, the coastal towns in San Mateo County have had challenges with water distribution. And there have been water moratoriums that have prevented development for years, including out in this part of Montera. And so it may be that there's a water issue, or there's an upgrade that's required if you have to improve infrastructure to build the house. I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand that local municipalities don't have big coffers where they can invest into infrastructure upgrades in communities. So a lot of that work falls to developers doing proposed projects. And homeowners building homes for themselves, in the eyes of local communities, are developers. And so a water main upgrade, a sewer main upgrade, a fire service upgrade obviously can get very expensive, as we all might anticipate, and could easily start to affect the economics of construction on a site. Now, in my book, I don't know that that's a reason to not explore property. It could be that if there's a, let's just be arbitrary, say there's $100,000 sewer line upgrade that would be required in order to plug in the new house to the existing infrastructure. Well, in one way or another, that might need to reflect in land value. And that may be happening as this property is falling in value, or they're reducing costs. And it could certainly present an opportunity for a prospective buyer to approach a seller with an offer. And so rather than offering what might be stated online as the proposed value of the property, we would come in and offer something less, the basis being that we have to do an infrastructure upgrade, or we have added foundation costs, or there's a road extension, or some of the other things that can get people tripped up might reflect on the reduction of the value of land. So I'd probably look at infrastructure on this one. I think a lot of the boxes otherwise get checked pretty cleanly. I think this is a good lot. I think this is a buildable lot, barring outside of what we don't know here. But I think this is a good example of a property that could work well for modular construction techniques.
Yeah, and the neighbors would probably appreciate it. Cool. That's awesome. Thanks for running through that. All right, let's keeping this moving. We're now going to, and we get this request like multiple times a week. This is, I forgot, do you live in Oakland or Berkeley? I always
yeah, my headquarters is in the Oakland Hills, so that's
Oakland Hills. So this is Toby might like go cycling or walking by this lot. But we get this specifically. We get like constant requests of, hey, there's this like fairly affordable, right, $400,000 piece of land in the Oakland Hills or the Berkeley Hills or whatever. Can I build on it? And sometimes, so I'm sure you get the same request a lot. How would you, and usually it's sort of hard to tell on these photos how steep this slope actually is, but I'm pretty certain that there's probably, at least a 2-story drop from, the building. So, there's at least a 20 or 30 foot drop probably on the building pad alone. But yeah, so how would you think about evaluating this piece of land?
Yeah, I think this is a great one. Interesting, Michael. Maybe part 2 of this should be like, we should find some lots that are exactly like you say. Like I found I found a $10,000 lot.
Yeah.
It's surrounded by $1 million homes.
Right. Right.
It's a real indication there that probably something is super challenging about that lot,
Right.
because otherwise its value would be that 20, 25, 30%, of the $1 million. So how come this lot is so different
Right.
than other lots around me? So I think this lot's value is already an indication of buildability, or at least
Right.
the sellers believe the property is eminently buildable. So I
Right.
think this lot, like you said, has the obvious observable stuff that primarily pertains to slope. I think the carry on to that, even though it's a little technical, is that there may be some relationships to the technical condition and the soils conditions that could drive reasonably complicated or costly foundation systems.
Mhm.
A lot of times in the Bay Area hills, we use foundations that are called pier and grade beam foundations, essentially drilling, big tubes of concrete into the sort of bedrock around in order to get away from these fill and sometimes softer soil conditions that exist on these slopes that are often historical in nature. A lot of times when they built these old roads, they just dump the soil onto one side of the road and you get this sort of unengineered fill condition, which is not adequate for the construction of new homes. So in this one, I think this is a little bit of the slope condition. I think there's a little bit of understanding the geotechnical part. There's definitely some elements of understanding the jurisdictional controls, because there are some unique conditions that are associated with building in the Oakland Hills and the Berkeley Hills. Zoning controls on one hand are rigid because of various envelope requirements for height, setbacks, etc. On the other hand, as slopes get steeper, there's a relief from some of those requirements, particularly about how far off the road you need to go, because if it's steep, you want to be close to the road.
Right.
I think the issue on this particular property probably goes back to construction methodologies. So this one probably starts to look like an initial exploration that could be related to access and staging. Getting to this particular site up in the hills is not that easy. There's a lot of tight, windy roads that lead us up to this site. There are multiple ways to get to this property. So this would be something where we might start a route haul, a haul route investigation. And in the work that you and I do, we know there's different ways to do that, from, crane people to transport folks to pilot car companies that actually do route haul observations, to just general contractors that are associated with the staging and delivery of the building. But that would be step one for me, is just looking at the various turns getting up to the site. Generally, I advocate for folks that 2-lane windy roads are usually pretty easy to navigate. There's specialized trailers and such that allow for the delivery of modules. Of course, they can be sized accordingly as well. But I think that the road is also very narrow on this property. So looking at how we would set up the crane, how you might take delivery, which is a question of, trucks coming in and trucks getting out. You got to be able to get out of the site. So what does that look like? How would that influence our sense of construction methodology? I think that's probably where this site needs an initial investigation. Of course, that could open up the opportunity that modular construction as a prefab method may not be the right version of the project for this site. Therefore, panel systems, other kinds of technologies I know that are, friendly to you guys and that are part of your site are also applicable in these types of instances as well. So I'd probably start there, and then probably the additional information related to the geotechnical condition would be the next piece. We can see over here on the left that the seller, or at least the real estate agent, has already identified the utility connections. And given the fact that there are homes on either side, I would not expect a big infrastructure question on this property. And I think the property is potentially valued as such. It would not be out of the question that a new home on this property that likely has bay views and such would be, valued in the $1.5 to $2 million range pretty easily.
So that's all awesome diligence. So when we were talking about evaluating the site, like I can tell you what we do a lot of times. A lot of times, like, there's a handful of crane companies. So like Haddon is one good one, right? So literally call a few of the crane companies and basically just check in on, like, will you deliver a bunch of mods to this site? Would that, what would be your sort of like sort of, I don't know, diligence waterfalls, or I think they like, what would be the sort of step by step that you would go? And again, I know you do this all the time, so can you just eyeball it and know, or would you end up going to sort of a specific vendor and asking them, can you do this?
Yeah, kind of. I think it sort of depends on where people are in their process. If
Yeah,
you've identified a solution or you like a fabricator's product that is a specific size and shape, I
yeah,
think that presents one avenue of exploration. Can
uh,
I get so and so house up to this site because it's a product of
yeah,
sorts that might be more rigid in its design? It might
right,
be a clear answer of yes or no. I do find that a lot of companies that fabricate do have some resources to explore these
yeah,
kinds of questions. And so
mhm,
if you called up, so and so prefab
right.
house, that they would be able to help provide a little bit more resource. If you're kind
I
of
kind of assume that they end up just doing exactly what I just described, which is then they call their crane company.
yeah, they call it crane company. I
Yeah,
mean, if you're sort of working more on the architect side, kind of
yeah,
where I live,
right,
we
right.
do some of
Call
this work
you,
too.
call the
If
moving
there's
company. Yeah,
local people, we might drive to the site.
yeah,
Again, I do a lot of Google Maps and just sort of drive the route myself from that point where you get off the highway and try to eyeball it there. And then there's a few companies that we work with that actually do for a small fee. They'll do a report on the
yeah,
entire route. And so we can hire them. Sometimes they're the crane guys, sometimes they're the I find that the pilot car companies
yeah,
are actually a lot of the folks that offer these types of services. They tend to be a little bit more regional,
yeah,
so they might also be easy to access. And usually, pilot car companies do this for all kinds of transportation,
yeah,
buildings, and equipment, and infrastructure, and big pipes, and whatever. And so, usually they've got some resources to figure out, if you could haul a giant excavator up to a particular property, that's a pilot car company might be able to help with a little bit of that reconnaissance. And then I ultimately find, Michael, usually somebody on the set crew side or from the factory is
yeah,
going to bring a representative at some point before the project gets too far along
yeah,
to not necessarily confirm if you can do it. Obviously, our hope collectively is that
yeah,
we can confirm that prior to a project really starting out, but the more to the specifics of the kind of equipment that might be used to deliver. As we know, and maybe another moment here to educate folks down the road would be to just do a quick intro on like what kinds of trailers there are, how
yeah,
different techniques work for getting
totally.
around tight turns. There's a kind of cool stuff in the marketplace. So I want people to not necessarily be discouraged
Yeah,
by tight access. Obviously, it could be a limitation,
mhm,
but there's a lot of cool innovation in the modular space on the delivery side, and some cool stuff that we've seen people do that can make sometimes the tighter parts of access actually a lot more navigable. So I'd probably look for this one. I'd probably start there, look at the route, set the crane up. Once you get those boxes checked, I think getting back to the other parts of your checklist that get to development standards and other zoning controls would be a good next step.
got it. That's all really helpful. All right, let's keep moving. All right, so now we're doing something that's big raw land. Okay, so it says, what is this? Okay, so this is, yeah, this is a place that actually just sold. Um, and this is in Forestville, so that's just north of me, and Forestville is essentially Sonoma County. Kind of rural parts of it are sort of ruralish Sonoma County, I think near the Russian River. And just so you can see, this is like a it looks like there's some kind of like small mobile home on this. So I would kind of ignore that for the, see if we can get to some better photos of this. But yeah, you can see there's definitely a road of some kind on this. Um, and there's some cool trees and there's a lot of land. And yeah, it's pretty remote. But yeah, but it's 25 acres, which is cool. So yeah, this is very standard of hey, I just learned about this other modular thing. I really like the way it looks. Can I drop it here? So maybe you can talk a little bit about the considerations for doing diligence on a piece of land like this.
Yeah, so obviously the first part a little bit is kind of what we just went through, is just looking at the access issues. When you've got rural property, what is the condition of the road? Is there a road at all? Is that something that we could bring a crane down? Could we bring trailers with modules down. Again, lots of different techniques come to play. Single-story homes don't even need to use cranes in some instances, so there's a question there. Obviously, there's different ways of bringing mods down dirt paths. We've used excavators in the past to pull modules, so I think navigating across an improved property is actually not that challenging. I think the place to start with rural property is really about infrastructure. The two things that are sort of most obvious to me, although in a lot of properties these are already developed, are well and septic systems.
Right.
The intersection with environmental health departments, which are the agencies that regulate septic systems and wells, are really challenging agencies to work with, not unto themselves, but the laws and codes are rigorous and effectively immovable. And so there's setback requirements from where we put wells. Obviously, there's a lot of setback issues as it pertains to septic systems. Both of these relatively simple systems can be deceptively costly. Wells can get very deep. There can sometimes be impurities and other sort of toxins in well water that have to be filtered out that can generate complex filter systems. Septic systems require percolation tests. Different soil has different characteristics. So these kinds of things are really where I would start. If there's existing property development or development on the property, that's a great sign. If there are well systems in place, a lot of properties are sold with wells. That's great news. You can understand about the flow rates, how that affects your water system, fire sprinklers and such. Septic systems can be perked and not built, so that can at least give an indication of, for example, in Sonoma, how many bedrooms you could have in your house. So this is where I'd probably start there. How much do we know about the infrastructure on well and septic? The next thing that for me,
so that's awesome. And so for this one, for example, one of the interesting things you see, and perhaps one of the reasons it recently sold, is you can see there it says new 4-bedroom septic system installed.
Exactly.
And you can actually also see that, again, we can't see every turn on these roads, and they're, a little bit narrow, but, it's probably 12 feet wide, and not too crazy. And there's probably, you can see there's probably some kind of infrastructure, at least minimally, to
well, the next piece that I was going to go to was just the fire department. Fire departments are actually pretty friendly agencies to work with a lot of shared interests about defending property from fire. But I think being able to, have a fire marshal speak to you about your property that's in a rural location can be super valuable. A lot of people don't know that your fire infrastructure, road access and such actually needs to be in place and inspected before you can take delivery of modules or start framing with a panel system on site. So you can see some of the older photographs on this listing show the dirt road. Here you can see the gravel, which was improved. So the fire department required the access road to meet their standard. And that likely they also were required to provide a turnaround.
I was going to say that we've had some costly turnarounds that we've had to add to properties because
they're huge, right? You're turning around a fire truck in a 3-point
pretty big radius. Exactly.
Big thing. Yeah. So they have different shapes and such, but they are required. And I think you can see on this image.
This one would be fine.
Yeah. Probably that's why you had this little spur that comes up past the house.
Right.
So that's probably all a turnaround shape. And all of that was improved in order to set this mobile home on the property. Most of that infrastructure work, wells, septic, fire, roads, etc., happens regardless of the size, shape, or complexity of your home. These are all sort of basic conditions that need to be in place prior to any construction activity. So this is kind of where I start on the rural side, and then you can kind of work your way backwards towards these questions of, access and setting and such, or the more detailed investigations of soils. A lot of times the condition for some technical documentation is also different in rural locations. Some places we aren't required to do detailed topographic surveys or geotechnical work. We can often work off of, more simple documents that's sort of project by project, but there's definitely a different condition working on rural properties than I think properties in an urban or suburban area. So this looks like a great lot. I mean, somebody's going to have a wonderful opportunity to either, build something new here or to enjoy this little retreat. But yeah, I think you can see some of those unimproved conditions that looks like they were probably dealt with when they set the mobile home. We're able to make this property, compliant.
Yeah, this is definitely one of the ones where I think Toby alluded to it on the sort of fire marshal person. This is also, just to be clear, this may be an area that's quite high fire risk. I haven't dove deep on it. So just in terms of insurance, again, let's just assume that on whatever the rule was, 4 or 5x the price is sort of the after build value, right? So we're talking about $2.5 million. You could easily see insurance for something like this, I think in the like 10,000 plus annually. So I would at least in California, there are sort of state associated insurance programs that so it's rare that lots are completely uninsurable, but frequently they're very expensive.
Well, the California Fair Plan will take on any property. It's part of our new, state requirements for insurance. So it's inherently insurable. Whether or not it's a good policy or questions I think people are asking. I think you make a really good point, though, about just observations of being in these kinds of environments. These are high fire risk zones. There's good technology and code requirements for the building itself. There's best practices and requirements for managing defensible space and the trees and vegetation, but clearly something that has an influence on the project from its conception to its ownership in one form or another.
And then the other thing on projects like this that are, as we mentioned, are just the soft costs. So things other than money going directly to contractors on something like this could be pretty high in terms of impact fees and stuff like that.
Yeah, Sonoma County is an expensive place to build, all but for your next slides, which I think are the burn lots, which do have some other opportunities that other properties don't, and can actually be pretty good value in a lot of Sonoma County and parts of Napa.
Sorry, guys. So quickly speaking, Toby, and I know we're getting to the top of the hour. Do you have time to keep going through these last 2 slides? Or all right, we're gonna keep rolling. Well, thank you for your generosity with your time. Sure. All right, so this is and again, these are fire rebuild lots in Sonoma County, but generally speaking, we've dealt with a lot of things related to natural disasters, fortunately or unfortunately, over the last few years. Unfortunate, obviously, because people lose their homes. I think we're fortunate to be able to help. One of the things that's really nice about sort of prefab and modular technology is it gives you an opportunity to kind of extend the number of people who can build on a house. So there's this sort of cycle that happens in these areas of, okay, there's a huge disaster. And then, oh, wow, if you need to build like hundreds or thousands of homes in a place where, they might build 50 a year before, there's a total mismatch of demand and supply of contractors. So the cost to build goes up. It ends up creating a lot of chaos. So I think one of the reasons that you've seen modular be a really appealing solution in a lot of these areas is because it's like, okay, a lot of times you have good infrastructure in place, but you can actually have a lot of the work that would be hard to get contractors do them elsewhere. Okay, so now that you heard my my TED talk on that, we'll go to this lot in Santa Rosa County, which is Santa Rosa, which is a city also in Sonoma County, and you can see there was a fire, but you can see a lot of the foundation and building pad is still there. So what would you consider here? And it looks like the power lines are still there as well.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you got your standard stuff, so we can kind of do the access, and we can do the crane setup, and we can do maybe a little power line. Although a lot of projects we've done in this area haven't been too encumbered.
I would assume this is probably the prior house, just so you can see.
Right. Yeah. I with you. I think our heart is out, obviously, for everybody who's lost homes. Hopefully, have been at least safe in their evacuation. But it's definitely a heartbreak. But it is an opportunity for for any new buyer in Sonoma County in particular. I think there's a lot of opportunity to accelerate a process and limit some of those fees that you just talked about. For some of the burn lots, the first things we look at are largely infrastructure. So a lot of these properties in this area are on well and septic systems. There is a process for receiving a report of sorts that demonstrates that the wellhead was not damaged by fire, or there were no toxins which leached into the well, which was a problem for a while up in these areas. That the septic system was in a similar condition. The lids are, fine, or the septic system wasn't irreparably damaged during the fire. Fire does actually get into the ground a little bit when it burns this hot. And so as long as those systems are in place, that's usually really good news because they're permitted to be reutilized for the new construction. So one of the things that I sort of talk to clients about for these kinds of build projects is that, building in the modern moment requires everything new and modern. We unfortunately have not had any success in recycling or repurposing old construction on a property. So in this instance, we would probably be somewhat skeptical that the foundation could be reused. There may be, from engineering principles, reasons that you could, but the process to demonstrate that it can meet current laws and codes has been pretty rigorous and costly as compared to demolishing it or removing it, which was done in a lot of properties after FEMA cleaned up. They removed a lot of concrete spalls. When it's hot, it gets dry, it gets kind of dry, it kind of crumbles. So a lot of the top parts of this concrete are probably not acceptable under current codes. Of course, the geometry for prefab buildings in particular is very precise. And so we would probably advocate for removing the concrete, or at least finding ways of getting in and through it so that we could keep parts of it, which is not out of the question. I've told clients in the past, I look at old foundations on burn lots a little bit like they're, rock outcroppings. So what would you do with rocks? Well, you remove them, you build around them, you try to tie to it if you can, but more or less a lot of this stuff gets removed. I think it's also important to understand that new building projects in this area require new surveys. When the cleanup happens after fire, often 12 to 24 inches of soil is removed from the site. When you burn a house to the ground, all the stuff that was toxic in your house is now, in the soil. And so a lot of that soil is removed for obvious reasons. That creates effectively new topography. It's not often refilled. It just creates kind of a new ground plane that we work against that can have some impacts to driveways and roads and access. I think it's also important to understand that building a modern foundation requires a geotechnical analysis in most of these locations. So we do new surveys, we do new geotech reports. They are required for reconstruction projects. That's not one of the things that we get a pass on. And then as you go forward, it's nice to know that Sonoma and to a degree Napa have resiliency agencies that have been set up to allow reconstruction, as you say, to happen a little bit faster than the general law of supply and demand affords. So permitting in these areas is particularly fast. We've seen permits for some of our projects in days, not weeks or months, but it's been pretty fast. It's also without fees. And so the communities are, of course, very eager to see new homes on all of these properties. And so they're really trying to facilitate that. Maybe the last note that I think has been relevant to projects that we've worked on that is important for people to understand is that generally we have seen that the fire departments are not requiring upgrades to roads or driveways or turnarounds, things that we just talked about, for properties that are being rebuilt unless some function of the existing condition prevented the fire department from reasonably defending the site. Now, in the Tubbs fire and some of the other last fire, the fires up there were really ferocious. I don't think the fire department was impeded anywhere. They almost couldn't keep up with the fires. So we have not seen fire-related upgrades required for the site themselves. Now, new buildings in California require fire sprinklers, so you do need to account for water storage and such for a lot of these rural sites. But often the good news is that you don't have to build the driveway to a new standard. You don't have to build a turnaround to a new standard. These are fairly impactful design and engineering conditions for any property, let alone one which was already previously developed. So that's a little bit of good news that goes with the accelerated permit and reduced fee aspect of fire reconstruction. So for these reasons, I really think there's good value in a lot of these burned properties. If people can kind of psychologically get back onto the site and understand the risk of fire, it's real, it will remain. I do think there's a lot of opportunity to find well-valued sites with existing infrastructure that are, in these locations as compared to building new. Now, if you build a new house on an adjoining lot that has not been previously developed, even though it's in a fire zone, that lot still requires all of the rigorous, campaigns for engineering, permitting, impact fees, et cetera. They don't have any additional pass, if you will, for new buildings on undeveloped lots. But yeah, I think this is a great lot. Looks like a wonderful opportunity, great views off this property. And I think the real estate values in a lot of these locations are continuing to climb pretty quickly.
One of the things you'll notice about this, and again, we won't belabor this because we kind of talked about this on the Montera property, is this property went contingent in 2020, which basically means it was like they agreed to an offer and then it probably, fell out for whatever reason, probably because there was some kind of inspection process where, the buyer backed out. And that could be all sorts of reasons. It could be because the buyer wasn't that serious. It could be, and who knows, that was 2020. So all sorts of weird stuff was going on. Most likely, my guess on a property like this is when they got down to it, they found that sort of all the infrastructure costs involved with doing this lot were probably more expensive than they had imagined. And yeah, again, you can see there's consistent drops in price here. So, because again, this is we could run comps later, and this sort of gets to, this gets to the sort of economic questions around this. But I mean, this is a really big piece of land with really amazing views that's really private. If you built, just totally this is back of the envelope math here. Let's just say you built a really pretty high-end home here that was modular. Let's just say you might be able to do it in the $600 per square foot range if you did a 3,000 square foot house. I think the math, unless there were major infrastructure costs, would check out for a property like this, because this is, again, a pretty epic view and a pretty reasonably cool place. So again, there are a lot of reasons, so I'm really getting into speculation here, but my guess about why this hasn't sold despite all the price drops is a lot of the sort of site related costs might be pretty considerable. So
yeah, I think that you state the obvious, but I think super important for people to understand is that looking at that price history can teach you something. And so if nothing, it raises some flags on, well, why did this contingent offer fall apart? If it was contingent upon, buying another property or selling another property or something in the infrastructure and the deal fell apart, that kind of makes sense. But then somebody worked for about 2 years with this lot before it was relisted. And maybe that was a campaign to develop a new proposal for the site. That's where the disclosure packages can really come to be valuable next steps for people as they find lots they're interested in. And then clearly over the last, 6-7 months, there's been, a pretty steady reduction to try to keep this, to try to get this thing sold.
move it, yeah.
Yeah. And so, but maybe again, these things that we're speaking to, maybe the well system was damaged, or that the septic wasn't. I don't know if that's been in the listings at all or not, or, if the access condition was such that the fire department has required an upgrade to the driveway, and now it looks like a much more expensive project than it was previously. It may be that sometimes people just have different ideas. This was an old, whatever, 2,500 square foot home that burned down.
Yeah.
Somebody wants to build a new 5,000 square foot home, and now you've got this mismatch between what was and what is. And the county does have a different process when you start to build in a different location or a much larger home. These sort of opportunities to move through the accelerated process do change depending upon what the project proposal was. I think I'm with you. This looks like an interesting lot. It certainly has the right characteristics. The land is valuable. The opportunities for the view seem like they're pretty sweet. I think it might just be trying to figure out, well, why is this thing not moving quickly? And maybe it's just also a saturated market. There are a lot of lots for sale up here. Some that might be a little easier to develop. May also be that this is kind of way up the road, and maybe people are looking for something a little bit closer to
it's
town.
basically just if you look at the directions, it's basically 2.5 miles from the road, which again could be
not huge, but grabbing groceries. Yeah, exactly. So this is kind of where I think, just to go through your list, like I think some of these things like access is clearly something to look at because we can't really see all of the conditions of the roadway. I think setting up cranes and such, probably not a massive problem, but something to look at there. I think it really goes back to infrastructure and then potentially some disclosure on whether or not there's details that have been developed previously that might help qualify the value of the property.
Okay, that's awesome. Okay, so the last one on here, this is I think a project Toby's actively involved in, and for those, one of the, I'd say, I don't know, constructive or general criticisms that we get sometimes on this site, Toby, are we really try to service people across the country, and we work with people across the country. But California is where I live, and we've done probably as many projects in California and New York as anywhere. So we get this, hey, you speak too much to California issues where the houses are crazy expensive, and that's not specific to me. So big warning, this is like going to be that to the nth degree. This is a project called AB9. Toby can probably better explain it to me, but just like the quick summary is AB9 allows you to essentially split any single family residential property with a few caveats into 2 single family residential properties, which can then also have ADUs on them, I believe. So essentially, and you might even have junior ADUs on them. So you could basically split a decent sized single family lot that might have 1 house on it into 4 to 6 residents. This specific unit that we're going to talk through, as you can see, it's a very expensive lot. It's in excuse whatever the site is, a stately. It's was originally a $5 million lot. It's in Atherton, California, which is probably one of the like 5 or 6 most affluent areas of the country. But yeah, it's an example that we had some insight on, so we can dive into. So Toby, given that you know this project pretty well, do you think it's better to start here or start on the graphics, or do you just want to talk a little bit about AB9 in the project?
Yeah, so I think it's generally referred to SB9.
Oh, SB9. I'm sorry,
SB9. I think it's SB9. Yeah, so SB9 was passed in 2021. I'm not a full expert on SB9. There are people that are, and we can help direct clients to folks that ultimately can get into the details of how SB9 actually works. But effectively, this was a law passed in 2021. I believe it became active on January 1st in 2022. It's part of California's overall campaign to increase housing inventory and to, I suppose, at a deep level, question single family zoning. And so, Atherton's an interesting town because there's a lot of big lots. Clearly, this has created a sense of politics because people enjoy their big properties, but there is a lot of land and, housing demand in all areas, certainly in this part of Silicon Valley is really high. And so SB9, really intends to offer owners of single family property sort of 2 basic functions, and they can come together. One basic function is to allow 2 dwellings on all single family properties. So every property that's single family zoned that meets a certain criteria, it's not every property, you have to be more or less kind of a standard type of property, can't have unique conditions, but all properties can have 2 primary dwellings. And so they do need to meet development standards for things like setbacks and such. But if you have the space, you could build a duplex, or you could build 2 primary dwellings on every lot. The other thing that SB 9 affords is the opportunity to subdivide a single family home or a single family lot into 2 properties. Again, there's standards and requirements that go with this. There are also technical issues that go with that subdivision, but the minimum lot sizes are very small. So it is almost permissible on all single family, more conventional single family zoned lots. I think the zoning part is really important. If your property is zoned for multifamily dwellings, or if your property is zoned for commercial uses, these laws don't apply. These are for single family zoning throughout the state. So the lot split can also be combined with the multiple dwellings. And so in principle, every single family lot is permitted to be subdivided, and each lot can have 2 dwellings. So it sort of offers you, 4 dwellings on one property. There are a host of measures that are required. They require affidavits. You have to live in one of the homes. You have limited.
So they have to be owner occupied, right?
Yeah, for a certain number of years. There's some elements of that, how it gets rented out. If you rent, that's part of it. But there are lots of opportunities as well. You can sell some of these properties. You can sell newly created lots. Because they are newly created lots. In this particular instance, this is something that has to be sorted through. This has an existing home. It's sort of pushed towards the rear of the property. The SB 9 proposal tries to put a lot line in between. But one of the things that this homeowner is going to have to do is ultimately reorganize all of the infrastructure that serves this existing home to allow for a legal parcel to be created. In other words, legal parcels don't have neighbors' sewer lines running through them, or electrical lines, or water lines, or trees, or other things that impact your property. All have to be addressed. So this property in particular is served with utilities that kind of come right through this view, through the driveway. Assuming that lot line kind of runs like horizontally across the screen, we've got to effectively move all those utilities to a different location so that the lot itself is not encumbered by easements or other kinds of things that would be required in order to bring utilities across one person's property to serve the other. So this property is going through a variety of technical issues that pertains to utilities. There's also some historical elements to this property that have to be reconciled as part of that lot split as well. But there's a great opportunity on all properties in California to enact these kinds of proposals to increase density, to provide revenue, to offer multiple properties to sell or lots to sell that hopefully just improves the condition for housing. I think unfortunately the adoption of SB 9 has not really spurred a movement yet. The number of applications is surprisingly low in the state of California over the last 2 years. There's only been a handful of these things that have been done, but I think architects, developers, planners, people are trying to really push this out further into the public so that people are aware of these opportunities for the chance that somebody is capable of or interested in trying to improve the density in the in the neighborhood or for these kinds of lots. Now, interestingly, and I think this touches on something that you said, when you enact SB 9, you also lose your by right ADU opportunities. So you can have 2 dwellings. One could be an ADU, but you can't have 2 dwellings and an ADU. That would get back to development standards for the number of dwellings that could be on a given property, or setbacks and height restrictions and coverage requirements, and those kinds of things can be sometimes challenging. So you kind of get one or the other in California. The ADU movement, I think, is pushing across the country. We're seeing this, now state by state, a lot of opportunities to build accessory dwellings, and hopefully similar SB 9 kinds of movements will be taking place. I think Portland just outlawed single family zoning, or at least that's
Portland and Minnesota.
And Minnesota too. Yeah, so that's kind of cool. I think we're starting to see finally a push towards higher densities in our communities. And I know there's going to be some heartburn to this, particularly in a town like Atherton, where people really enjoy these large parcels, but there are also opportunities to, just add more housing to our communities.
So maybe, if it's okay, do you want to just describe, I think these are some of the parcel maps about how you're actually dividing this?
Yeah, essentially. So, you can sort of see the house up there on the top part of that site. Yeah, where your cursor is. There's a lot that's being created called parcel B, which is below it. There's a sort of buildable envelope. You can see that little square there. But you can see this is a draft copy. There's some things that
Right.
have come back we need to address now. But if you just move your mouse just a little bit over to the right, you'll see some vertical lines on the seam that are kind of
Yeah.
these utilities that are coming across parcel A. Right. So in order to serve utilities across a parcel, you either need an easement so that I've got access to your lot for my utilities, or you have to clean up this parcel and relocate those utilities. And that work needs to take place effectively before a final map can be issued. So the way a lot of these lot splits happen in SB9 is very similar to creating any lot. It has to go through a tract map process. It is ministerial. That's really what SB9 opened up, was that it removed the discretionary actions from these proposals and pushed this to a ministerial process that can be approved at staff level. And so that said, it still requires a clean parcel. So as an example, those utility lines have to be relocated. Once the preliminary map is approved, then you can relocate the utilities and do all the work. And then once that's done, the final map can be issued, which creates the legal parcel that gets recorded. So this one has some issues with utilities. It's got a couple big trees that have to be sorted through, and then just reorganizing the driveway. Right now, the driveway for this property comes in, you can see off of Glenwood right at the bottom of the lot, has this big kind of turnaround and parking area. And so obviously that gets abandoned when you build a new property. And so this is actually a flag lot condition, and the access is going to be way over on that left-hand side of the lot, where you can actually see a bunch of those new utilities and that 20-foot driveway, which is going to come back and serve parcel A. Now, interestingly, because that property, the driveway access is now going to exceed 150 feet, which is a fire department requirement for trucks, and being able to turn them around, the new driveway is also going to require a turnaround that has to be accounted for within the geometry of the site, so that it effectively can be a legal access to the newly created parcels, both for the parcel B, but also the sort of retroactive repair work or renovation work that's required for parcel A, in order to make it compliant. So sort of an interesting opportunity. One of the other things I think is just interesting to know about SB9 is that it does require a proportional relationship that can't exceed 60-40. So any lot that you create has to be a minimum of 40% of the original lot. So they are looking for parcels to be created which are more or less co-equal, rather than just carving out a little corner of your property and calling that little postage stamp, a new lot.
And
But
is there,
lots
I forgot, is there a design review? We haven't, like, have not done many SB9 projects with prefab review, that we've looked at quite a few. Is there a design review for the second unit here or not?
Well, that's going to be town by town. So Atherton does not have a specific design review process that requires a commission approval. It's all just coordinated by the planning department at staff level.
Yeah. And one of the things, again, not, as I said, I generally really like planning departments. California has a lot of new housing legislation, and sometimes the bias towards some of these, again, not speaking about Atherton specifically, some of these suburban housing planning groups is to be a little conservative on stuff, and they're not always 100% informed on every nuance of these new laws. At least I found. So what I find is sometimes, unfortunately, you'll go to planning, you'll ask for guidance on stuff, and the really nice thing about most of the new laws is they're very transparent. You'll get feedback that is actually not exactly the law. It's like some kind of jumbled interpretation by somebody. So what we end up doing, I'm not sure if you do this as well, is I believe it's called HCD, which is the state like sort of housing regulators. They're actually quite responsive to individuals and quite aggressive about trying to make it clear to local planning departments, like, this is what the law is. So again, in my personal experience, you get some weird email chains of like people sort of aggressively CCing local people, but can actually be very clarifying and helpful. So particularly for these like ADUs is the area that we've sort of seen this most frequently. It can be really helpful. So I would, on anything new and legislative, I would, especially if it's at a state level, definitely check with the state if you're getting answers that are weird as part of the sort of diligence process.
Yeah, there are some quirky things about the ADU laws and how they get executed, and some of them, in order to happen, have to happen sort of post occupancy of projects, and so there's some timing
And like
issues.
the state technically like still enforces the permitting, even though, yeah, it's supposed to be pretty ministerial. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I have found that a lot of communities now have kind of handouts, or they've done workshops where they've kind of worked through what their, response is going to be to
yeah,
some requirements. But I think it's true that you do get different questions that sort of emerge case by case, where there's interpretation.
yeah,
Can I take this part of my house and turn it into an ADU, even though it has a non-conformity? That's a question, right? So then how the planning departments respond to some of these things is definitely not always clear. So
yeah,
I think you're right. HCD is a great resource, certainly here in California. That's Housing and Community Development, that regulates a lot of these laws and codes within the state. They've got some specific information about how that law is being, accounted for within municipalities. And as we said at the beginning of this session, getting down and talking to a planning department representative or a planner is just invaluable in any lot investigation. I think that's imperative for anyone. And as I tell my clients, I don't think that anybody needs to become an expert, but you should feel well informed. And I think that being able to get down and just hear firsthand how some of these laws impact the potential development of a property that someone owns or is looking at owning can be a really great part of the due diligence process for sure.
yeah. Well, just I think this is the last lot. So Toby, thank you for being so generous with your time.
Yeah, thank
This
you.
has been awesome. And thanks everyone for watching. If you if you're made it to the end of this and you are interested in learning more about Toby, he's at Clever Homes, which I believe is cleverhomes.net. He's very responsive if you send emails. And again, we're at prefabreview.com. So thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Michael.
Yep.